Hi there. So today is April 11th, 2023. So as of yesterday, I've been on the carnivore diet for 12 weeks. My current weight is 344 pounds. My weight loss since starting carnivore is 47 pounds. And my total weight loss to date is 196 pounds. So I'm going to read you a statement here because we're going to be talking a little bit about some of the kind of medical aspects that I'm using with this carnivore lifestyle. So this is a disclaimer. I am not a doctor or medical professional of any kind. I'm simply someone with a lifetime of struggling with health issues. Don't take my word for anything as gospel truth. I encourage you to do your own research and verify information I talk about in my videos. So to that end, I've actually got a playlist on this channel if you've never been here before. It's called Relevant Keto and Carnivore Links, or maybe Relevant Carnivore and Keto Links. So there's a ton of videos in there. I think there's close to 60 videos in that list. And most of them are from doctors and scientists talking about the research and the medical aspects of the carnivore lifestyle. There's a couple of them in there talking about keto as well. There's also another playlist of stories of healing. So make sure you check those out. I'm actually going to be interviewed by a naturopath that deals specifically with carnivore lifestyle from Australia. That interview is going to be happening on April 17th. So I'll make sure I put a link in the description after that interview so that you can go watch that on her channel. And I do have an upcoming couple of interviews that we had one of them actually booked, but some stuff came up and I have to reschedule it, but that's going to be coming soon on this channel. And I've also got some a couple of recipes that are going to get uploaded here pretty quick. I had my big physical last week and got the results back from my blood tests. So I thought I would share some of that with you. So let me just grab that. Okay. So this is like I basically typed this out from my online report because the way they lay it out is just not in a printable form. So if you wanted to pause and zoom in on that, you can. Now keep in mind that some of these numbers I'm going to give you, they may be using a different method of measurement from what you're used to. So if you want to compare these to your own, you may have to look online and convert from one form to another. For instance, a lot of measurements use the MOL/L. So I'm not sure exactly what that means. I'm not a doctor, of course. And then other ones use MMOL/L. So the numbers that are using the MMOL/L, basically, a lot of the labs down in the States, I'm in Canada, they'll use, I think, just MOL, but I'm not sure. But basically, you would just add a couple of decimal places to the numbers I'm talking about here to many of these. So the first thing that I've been a little concerned about, because I went off of all of my medications, like February 16th, my neurologist took me off my immunosuppressant, and then a few days later I went off my blood pressure medication and my thyroid medication. So to compensate for going off of my thyroid medication, I've been taking potassium iodide. So that's the Trophic brand. And I started off taking 1 drop a day and found that wasn't really doing it. And I went to 2 drops a day. It was better, but as of a few days before my tests, I had switched to 3 drops a day, and that seemed to do the trick. So they measured my T3 free at 4.3, and that's PMOL/L, and the normal range for that is 3.0 to 6.5, and my T4 free was 11.5, and the normal range for that is 10.0 to 25.0. And my TSH, it's actually a bit high, but it's my understanding that higher than normal is just more representing the potential for my thyroid to produce the chemicals that I need. So on that, I scored a 9.14. And that is MIU/L, and the range for that is supposed to be 0.20 to 6.5. So it's definitely a little high there, but for my research, it's nothing to be concerned about at all. So my triglycerides, they came out at 1.4, and they used to be, I think it was somewhere like 2.04 or something like that before, and that's MOL/L, and the normal range on that's supposed to be 0 to 1.70, and mine was a 1.42. My total cholesterol is 6.79, which is the MOL/L, and the rest of these are all in MOL/L. So I think you can just add a couple decimal places if you want to convert it to what you're using. So that would probably be like 679. And my HDL was 1.13. And my LDL, which wasn't directly measured, it was calculated, and that came out to 5.01. And the normal range for that is 0 to 3.4. So, that seems fairly high, but as we know for a carnivore, that's actually pretty normal, and it's a good thing. Now, my non-HDL was rated at 5.66, and the normal range for that is 0 to 4.2. So, just a quick word about why high cholesterol is not an issue for carnivores. See, what they've discovered with some fairly recent research is that the actual LDL cholesterol molecule, when it's working properly, it actually protects your arteries against clotting. And it's also a direct fuel for your brain and nerve cells, especially when you've taken sugar out of the equation. So that's what they actually will feed on. So if you want to have your brain cells and nerve cells and stuff regenerating and healing, then it's the LDL cholesterol is going to be greatly assistive in that. Now, what happens when you're eating sugars or carbs, hydrogenated oils, that type of thing, is that it causes a structural change in that LDL molecule. And once you get that subtle change in structure, it no longer protects your arteries against clogging and can actually increase clogging in your arteries. That's why it's a danger for most people when they're eating a standard American diet. But once you've gone carnivore, then those molecules are no longer subtly altered or damaged, and they become protective. So, like I said, don't trust my word for this. Do the research. Actually, I think one of the videos that are in that playlist I mentioned earlier talk about this specifically, and they actually go into great detail on the science behind it and all the research that they did to prove it. So this is proven science. My A1C, this is the big one. About a year ago, I was pre-diabetic. I had an A1C of 6.1. And then after being on keto for a while, my A1C went down to 5.7. But as of these last tests, my A1C now sits at 5.3, and that's measured in percentage. So that was some very, very good news there. So one of the big things I wanted to talk about this week is the dangers of eating more than 30% by volume in fat of the meat you're consuming. See, once I became fat adapted, I was able to eat a lot more fat. You know, and when I first started, of course, you know, I had a lot of problems with the nausea trying to eat fatty foods, even though when I was on keto, I used to love eating fatty foods. I mean, fat means flavor, so I loved it. But once I actually switched to carnivore, I started having these issues with nausea. Now, one of the tricks that I was told about and used, and it worked quite well, was I let my food cool to room temperature before eating it, and then it became easier to eat. Sometimes I still had to kind of force myself. There was 1 or 2 times where I just couldn't eat. I was just too nauseous. So I basically fasted for the day, kind of a thing. Actually, back then I was eating twice a day, so I probably just had something else for my second meal. But as I became fat adapted and time went on, I could eat more and more fat. So what I've discovered recently is that I actually was eating too much fat, and that both stopped my weight in some cases, and if I went really excessive, then I actually put a pound or 2 back on, sometimes in like one day. So it was a little concerning, but I finally figured out that that's what was causing it, because I had been making some dishes. Like, if you've been following other videos on my channel, you know that I made my own bacon. So I had taken a bunch of that bacon and chopped it up, threw it in the pan, fried it up, and then dumped my ground beef right in on top of that and cooked it right in it. And then when I served it up, I poured all that fat out of the pan into my beef. So I was probably, and actually, I had like a, you know, fairly big bowl that I just dumped it into. And, you know, the fat level was, you know, within like a ½ inch of the top of the meat. I mean, it was just swimming in it. And I would spoon up a bunch of the liquid fat with some of the meat in it. And, you know, I loved the flavor, and I ate it all up. And I did that, you know, 2 or 3 days in a row. And man, the results were bad. So you need to watch that. We really only need 30% by volume. And the other side effect is if I eat too much fat, then I get diarrhea. So, and that's never pleasant. So normally on the carnivore diet, I only have bowel movements once every 2, maybe 3 days. And it's a fairly small amount, but when I eat too much fat, then I'll start getting the runs, you know, 2 or 3 hours after I eat, kind of a thing. So that's just all around, that's just not really good for a person. And something I should mention as well is for pork, it shouldn't exceed more than about 30% of your total meat intake. So really 70% of the meat you're eating should be ruminant. In other words, animals that mainly eat grass. So like cows, goats, sheep, deer, moose, bison, elk, those types of animals, llama, alpacas. I don't know how many people eat meat from some of those animals, but though that's what you're looking for. Now, and I should say that when I say 70% should be ruminants, within that you can mix in chicken and fish. They're also really good. But there's just something about pork, maybe because of the type of fat it has and what the animals feed on, especially ones that you buy from the grocery store as opposed to a farmer. But even when you buy it from a farmer, you know, having too much of the pork fat in your diet is not necessarily a good thing. Those of you who followed us, you know that we actually bought a pig from a local farmer and butchered it ourselves. So, you know, and we know that it's a lot healthier and it's much tastier than pork we buy from the store. Now, something I want to address really quickly is there's been a lot of talk in the United States anyway about some food producers wanting to go with mRNA vaccines on treating the animals with it. And a lot of people are very concerned about that. Some people think it's already been going on, but from the research I've done, it hasn't happened yet. They're still awaiting approval. But there are already some companies out there that have come out and said, we will not be using it. So you need to look for those companies if it ever does start getting used. Unfortunately, down in the States, it's much more prevalent to use antibiotics like all the time on animals because it makes them grow bigger and grow faster. But antibiotics cause a whole host of other issues that really aren't ideal for humans to be eating that meat. But even eating that kind of meat, unless you are sensitive to it, is usually better than other foods that you could be eating. We all know how damaging those are. One of the reasons that you might want to try and find a local farmer or find an online meat supplier that doesn't use antibiotics or hormones or anything like that. And ideally, you want animals that are grass-fed most of their lives and only finished with grain or not finished with grain at all. Personally, I don't think finishing with grain is an issue as long as the grain they're finishing them with is organic and it doesn't exceed more than 3 months of the end of their lives. The reason that they use grain, even farmers that are raising grass-fed normally, is that it creates more fat marbling in the meat. So you get more intramuscular fat, which makes the meat more palatable, of course, because it'll cook out more tender and you get better flavor. And in our case, the more fat we can have within reason, the better. So just thought I would talk about that a little bit because I know a lot of people are concerned about it. I've been seeing a lot of questions back and forth on some of the Facebook groups I belong to for carnivore. So the next thing that we're going to talk about here is the products that I use aside from the food that I'm eating. So as you know, salt is kind of one of the main staples of the carnivore diet. And there's, a lot of people that argue back and forth, what's better, sea salt or special sea salt from a dry seabed or Himalayan salt or table salt or kosher salt. So there's a lot of schools of thought on this, and I've done a fair amount of research. So some of the things to be aware of is sea salt that is just collected from normal ocean water and evaporated out, that kind of a thing. It actually contains a lot of microplastics because of all the plastic pollution in the ocean nowadays, and that's really not good for a person. And sometimes it even has, some heavy metals and stuff in it, depending on where it's coming from. So normal commercial sea salt I would avoid. Now, that's one of the reasons that sea salt taken from a dry seabed, for instance, Redmond's Real Salt, they take their salt from the Great Salt Lake in Utah. And that's a perfectly fine salt. It's good, it's healthy, it's tasty. Lots of people use it in the carnivore community. Now, kosher salt, that's just like normal salt that comes from a salt mine. they just don't add anything to it. So there's no iodine or anything in it. And it meets the standards for being kosher for the Jewish community. And it's a salt that I use not that often because I like the flavor of what I use better. But I do use it for some things. Like I used it to cure my bacon, for instance. I can get it in bulk from a local bulk barn, and it's fairly inexpensive, and I can just, buy it in big bags. So then there's Himalayan salt. Now, Himalayan salt is actually sea salt. It's just that the oceans were raised up into mountains, millennia ago by tectonic action. And so those deposits are mined. Now, if you get stuff that doesn't have a bunch of junk added to it, Himalayan salt is really, really good. It's got a lot of trace minerals in it that some other sea salts don't have. Health-wise, there's probably not a great deal of difference, but I just prefer the flavor. I've tried all the other salts, and I just really like this. And it doesn't have to be expensive. I mean, there's stuff out there that is kind of pricey, but let me show you what I get. So let me just take the clip off the bag here. So this is just the Sundeed, and I get this off Amazon. And this is a 1 kilo bag or 2.2 pound bag. And I think I only pay like $11 or something for it. I'll leave a link down in the description. All of these products that I'm showing you, I'll leave links down in the description where you can find them. And now on to some of the other stuff. So I've got these electrolyte drops. Now, I'm not shilling for these guys. These are just the one that I like to use. And this is the Keto Chow electrolyte drops made for people on keto or carnivore diets. Now, this has trace minerals in it as well. And it's fairly inexpensive. Like this size of a bottle will last you anywhere from 1 to 2 months, depending on how much you're using every day. And I think this was about $30 or so. All these prices I'm giving you are in Canadian, by the way, so you can take off about 27% of that to convert to what it'll cost you in US funds. It's fairly accurate most of the time. So normally I was taking just one dropper, but I was a day, but I was finding that sometimes my muscles weren't recovering when I was being a little more active, so now I use a couple of dropperfuls a day. One dropper full is 1 milliliter, so that's, I take 2 milliliters a day. And now the other thing, I've talked about this I think once before on one of my other vlogs, and that's using apple cider vinegar. So one of the things I ran into when I was on carnivore for a while is my weight loss kind of stalled. And couldn't figure out why, because I was doing everything else the same. But it turned out, I'd been taking extra spoonfuls of butter to get extra fat, that kind of a thing. And I was still eating twice a day. So after doing a little research and getting some advice, I cut out taking the extra butter. I went down to 1 meal a day, and then I added apple cider vinegar. Now, it's important when you get apple cider vinegar to make sure that it's unfiltered, unpasteurized, raw, and contains the mother. And those are all very important aspects. And I take it 3 times a day. So I take a single tablespoon or 15 milliliters, and I mix that into a full glass of water. There's not a lot of vinegar taste once you mix it that far, so people that don't like vinegar, it shouldn't really be an issue. But if you really can't stand it, you could always add a little lemon to it as well, just to kind of help offset the flavor if you don't like that flavor. Me, I don't mind it. I like the taste of apple cider vinegar. We're actually going to be starting to make our own here when apple season comes along. We've got some people that will go together in to buy a bunch of apples from a producer down in BC, So, you know, we'll get like an entire case of apples, much cheaper than you'd pay in the store, and they're nice, freshly picked off the trees, so they're great apples. Now, as a carnivore, I don't eat them, of course, but I can certainly make my own apple cider vinegar. So this is the apple cider vinegar I use. I actually, when I first started, I got just like a normal size jar from the grocery store, and then I went through it very quickly. So then I got this sized one, and I was going through it so quickly. I now have I buy it by the gallon, and then I just refill this. But this is the Bragg brand, and this meets all the criteria that I just mentioned. And so I take 1 glass of this mix before I go to bed, and I take another glass of the mix in the morning. And then I take a glass of the mix 15 to 30 minutes before I eat. Now, by taking it before I eat, it actually changes how slowly it gets digested, so it helps me feel full for longer. And the apple cider vinegar itself actually boosts your metabolism. So by taking it before I go to bed, it actually creates more fat burning all night long as I sleep. So quite often the majority of my weight loss every day happens at night while I sleep. So, and I've proven this by, you know, I'll weigh myself just before I go to bed, and then I'll weigh myself when I get up again at about 5 or 6 in the morning. Or sometimes I'm up earlier, but I usually wait till 5 or 6 a.m. to actually do my weigh-in. And, you know, sometimes just in that 6 to 8 hour period, I've lost, well, last night, for instance, I lost 1.8 pounds just overnight. Now, that's not typical. Usually I lose about 1 to 1.2 pounds a day on this diet. But I was coming off of, I had like 3 days in a row where I'd had way too much pork fat. Even though I was having beef with it, I was just way overdoing it. So I'd had to go, and then I had to go a couple of days with just kind of staying away from any bacon fat. And of course Easter was in there, so we had like a smoked turkey and that kind of a thing. My wife won a smoked turkey from a local place. It was like really properly smoked with a vertical smoker. And, oh, it was fantastic, by the way. Now, we did have a little extra butter with that. So that stopped me from regaining a little weight every day, but I didn't lose any. But then yesterday, for my supper, I had a great big ribeye steak, and this morning when I got up, I was down 1.8 pounds. So that was a nice surprise. That covers the products I use. Now, I do use some granulated garlic, and I can't remember the brand of it right off the top of my head. I forgot to grab it to bring it in. It's just something we pick up from the grocery store. Just make sure when you're buying granulated garlic, check the ingredients list and make sure there's no fillers or junk in it. It should just be pure granulated garlic. Something else that I can use is liquid smoke, but make sure, once again, it's got no fillers. It should just be liquid smoke, nothing else in it. A lot of them add, you know, sugar and extra nitrates and that kind of thing. And you don't, I mean, nitrates, there was some controversy on that for a while, but some recent studies have shown that nitrates actually don't cause any harm. It's usually the other stuff that the nitrates are with that is actually causing the harm. So just a little tidbit of information for you there. Now, some people have an issue with black pepper. I don't seem to have an issue with it. I use a fair amount of it, and I don't seem to have any kind of response to it. I cannot eat other hot spices though. Any type of like red spice, something that comes from a hot pepper or anything like that, I react, you know, within an hour of eating it. My arthritis flares and my wrists get all stiff and painful and everything. So you'll have to do your own experimentation. Like we went through all of our spices and gave away everything that I thought might be an issue. I kept a few things that were a little different to try. Lemon pepper, for instance, we kept that, and it seems to be fine. But so we've got some rosemary salt that flared my arthritis, so I can't have rosemary. Now, olive oil is generally okay for carnivores as long as you don't overheat it if you're cooking with it. But it turns out I'm allergic to it. I thought it was just the garbage olive oil we had, so we went and got some high-end imported extra virgin olive oil from Greece. I even did a test to make sure it was pure, but when I did it, took a little test, a couple spoonfuls of it, I reacted really badly within an hour, and I was in pain for 3 or 4 days after that. So avocado oil, I've had some small amounts that seem to be okay, but I generally just stick to only animal oils, tallow, lard, suet, that kind of a thing. Now, lard, of course, comes from pork, tallow comes from beef, and suet actually is still beef fat, but it comes from the inner organs. It's a much finer, cleaner fat and requires less refining if you want to use it for cooking, that kind of a thing. Sometimes suet is the preference for carnivore foods like pemmican. So pemmican is actually something I'm going to be trying my hand at making. Especially good for if you're going to go on the road and you need some snacks, or you just need some kind of meals to have with you in case you can't find a place where you can safely eat. So sometimes traveling can be a real issue for us carnivores. So that's something I'm going to be doing, and I'll probably be posting a recipe for that. So a couple of recipes I've got upcoming is I did one. I just finished filming one yesterday when I cooked my big ribeye steak in the air fryer. It was like, we had bought a roast. My wife actually found one on sale, got a really good price. So I cut it into a couple of nice ribeye steaks. One of them was like 2 1/4 inches thick. I actually measured it. I couldn't believe how thick it was. And that actually was big enough for myself and my wife. So, and I've got the other one that I'm going to be eating today. She's out of town today, so I'll be having that one myself. That's it for today. Thanks for hanging out with us today. If you enjoyed this video, please make sure to subscribe and hit that like button. If you want to make sure you don't miss any upcoming videos, make sure to hit that notification bell. Appreciate you hanging out with us today. We'll see you on the next video. Bye for now.